So I welcome you. I think we should start, should get started now. And today, last time we did domestic mediation. Today we will do international mediation in terms of its incidence and the effectiveness, and probably the underlying factors to international mediation. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
What do you see? Owen is back. So you're seeing the Facebook page, huh? Okay. My intention actually, I'm trying to test if we can stream this class on Facebook. Okay.
Hello.
Yes. Let me set this up first. As a big class that I do on Tuesday mornings, and I cannot handle more than 100 people. So trying to see that I'm able to do that now. Okay, I think let's continue with our class. I'm not sure that will come through. Some people in the waiting room. I'm failing to share my screen. Should I stop the other one first? Yeah. Okay. Has the screen changed? All right. So yes, today we will reflect on international mediation. Last time we worked on mediation in the domestic context. And we understand mediation to be that process of conflict management where disputants seek the assistance of a third party, or they accept an offer of help from a third party. And this third party could be an individual, could be a group, could be a state, or an organization. To come and settle their conflict or resolve their differences without resorting to physical force or even invoking the authority of law. Okay. So that is our general understanding of what mediation would be, and again within this international context. We also know that in situations of international mediation, there are some antecedents, things that usually precede the choice to do international mediation. Usually, the parties at war have to agree on an intervener or a coalition of mediators. Is it going to be one person or a team? Okay. Then they negotiate with this intervener or these interveners and ultimately lose some degree of control over the bargaining process to the mediator. So the mediators then take charge of bargaining how the process is going to flow and sort of directing it. Remember, when we are doing domestic mediation, we indicated that there is a sort of trust that the parties put in the mediator. Now, both the combatants, which we would call the demand side for mediation, so the fellows at war, on different sides of the conflict, as well as the mediators, who would call the supply side, must have strong incentives. They must have strong incentives both for mediation to occur in the first place, which is incidence, okay, the incidence of mediation to occur, but also effectively bargain in order to reach satisfactory outcome, which would be effectiveness. So you will hear us using the word incidence of mediation and effectiveness of the mediation as we go along. Now, when we think about the factors that influence resort to mediation or the incidence of mediation, what factors have influenced the choice of mediation? Every time we've looked at conflict across the globe, how often have people chosen mediation, and what factors are underlying every time people have chosen mediation? First, there is a likelihood of eventual mediation success, meaning that the dispute appears relatively easy to solve, which thereby could increase the chances that there is a third party willing to intervene. Okay, so in this case, you're talking of parties have often chosen mediation when they see a likelihood of eventual success in the mediation. Secondly, there is the role of the previous conflict management history. And here they would be asking whether any mediation attempts of any other kind of conflict resolution approaches have been employed in this dispute before, and how it may have affected the likelihood or the incidence of mediation. There are two other factors that determine resort to mediation, or that determine the incidence of mediation or the selection of mediation. And that would be, there is a question of how domestic and international threats faced by the warring parties influence the mediation onset. Okay, so if they have any domestic threats, they're trying to see how do we solve it immediately. Does the mediation contribute to this solving the domestic threats, or it aggravates them? If there are international threats, does mediation contribute to solving them or not? The fourth underlying factor to the incidence of mediation is the characteristics of the conflict dyad. That is, its previous relationship, the country's or state's previous relationships, and ties towards each other. Their regime types or capabilities influence the chances of mediation as well. Now, this is a very important factor. When we do international relations, we use levels of analysis. Okay, units of analysis are individuals, organizations, and states. Okay, the units of analysis in international relations. But we also have the levels of analysis. We have the idiosyncratic level, we have the systemic level, and the international system. So what is usually at stake in all these levels might determine actually whether states will choose mediation or not. Okay, so yeah, so as you can see, the first two factors, likelihood of eventual mediation success. Two is the role of the previous conflict management history. Third is domestic and international threats by the warring parties. And the fourth is the characteristics of the conflict dyad, which includes the tools of analysis. You see, at the idiosyncratic level, the individuals involved, then the regimes, that is the systemic level, are the regimes capable of handling the process, and also at the international system level. Some examples of successful international mediations are the Good Friday Agreement that was relating to the Northern Ireland peace process. But we also have the Dayton Agreement of 1995 that settled the war in Bosnia. International mediation, however, should be noted, is quite costly, even though peaceful, according to Beardsley in 2006. The factors that influence the effectiveness. The other factors we talked about were influencing the incidence of mediation, factors that influence the choice of mediation. These ones are factors that influence the effectiveness of mediation. One is characteristics of the warring parties. Two is the characteristics of the dispute, meaning the intensity of the conflict, the duration, or the issues at stake. And third is the mediators as such, or the type of the mediation pursued. Okay, you see, if the mediators are the kind that would be listened to by the parties, the kind that is persuasive enough, then it would be effective. You know, when we had Kofi Annan come to Kenya, he turned up as one of the members of the Committee of Eminent Persons in Africa. And so he was able to sway or to engage the state effectively in that sense. The other factor, apart from the characteristics of warring parties, characteristics of the disputes, and the mediator as such, is this very important factor, which is interaction between the actors as a factor. Interaction between the actors as a factor of the effectiveness, as a factor of the effectiveness of mediation. And what do we mean by this interaction? See, interaction or coordination efforts of belligerents and all the mediating parties constitutes the definition of interaction. Okay, interconnectedness or coordination of efforts by both the disputing parties, who we are calling deliberants, and also the mediating parties. Because neither the disputing parties nor the interveners are independent agents who would be acting solely on their own and without any contact for each other before or during conflict. Okay, you'd realize that they all have interconnectedness of sorts. That's why we talk of interaction of these entities. So during the stage of negotiating the supply and demand of mediation, the warring parties and the prospective mediators are generally trying to agree on an intervention mandate. And during the actual mediation bargaining process, the belligerents, who would also be the disputants at the international scene at this time, as well as the mediators, have to interact with each other and support the antagonists to coordinate with the mediators and vice versa. And thereby they would be influencing the development and effectiveness of the actors' activities, which would in turn would be likely to shape these prospects, not only of mediation incidents, but also of effective third-party conflict resolution. So sometimes it is necessary in studying mediation to examine how direct and indirect links, it is necessary to examine how direct and indirect links between fighting parties could influence the onset of mediation. Okay, when do they decide, no, I think we need mediation? What is likely to be at the bottom? And we are saying that the direct and indirect links between the belligerents or fighting parties can influence when mediation would start, especially international mediation. Sometimes emphasis is placed on the demand side incentives And the argument is that stronger and more friendly relations between the belligerents make the onset of mediation more likely. However, the existing research on third-party conflict resolution generally examines this argument. I mean, the argument that the stronger the relationship, the more possible there will be an onset of mediation. And this argument is examined through links, that is bilateral ties. It is found through research that the theoretical reasoning for focusing on these kinds of ties would be incomplete since it does not consider the links to potential mediators. So it is not enough to talk or find links to potential mediators as influencing the process and effectiveness of mediation, but also the empirical support for the expectation that direct links facilitate mediation onset is not as strong as it should. And many conflict dyads either have no or few direct ties. Yet, you can see multiple mediation attempts. With regard to Israel and Egypt, for example, hardly did they have strong diplomatic contact. Neither did they have significant trade or any other sort of direct relations in their 1970s crisis. But their various disputes over the Sinai Peninsula experienced many mediation efforts. Okay? This is an attempt to distinguish that while it is the case that the interaction and interconnectedness between belligerents and maybe the mediator have a stake, it may not follow necessarily, and the example given is the Egypt-Israel issue over the Sinai Peninsula, which in the absence of a lot of interconnectedness actually was the subject of very many mediations. Previous studies have largely ignored that belligerents are typically interconnected through indirect lies. And indirect links as established, for example, through the network of intergovernmental organizations, connect the disputing dyad to multiple other actors and may thereby create connections between belligerents, even if direct links are either absent or torn apart. Now, unlike these direct links, the ties incorporate both demand and supply side influences. Since the preferences for the combatants in the context of their relationship with outside actors are largely into account. Now, by focusing on indirect links, the application of social network, the application of analysis, this approach would overcome the limitation. It can be argued that the indirect rather than the direct links between belligerents determine the direct rather than indirect means rather than the belligerents determine sorry about that. Someone is disrupting. We are saying that by focusing on indirect links and the application of social network analysis, we can overcome the limitation. And it can be argued that indirect rather than direct links between belligerents determine whether third parties are more likely to manage conflict. That's a very important thing to note. Indirect rather than direct links between belligerents. Okay, so state X is in conflict with state Y. They have some direct links, but many other indirect links. They will determine whether to go into mediation. I usually cite the example of Kenya and Uganda when they were bordering on getting at their necks over the Migingo Island. There are some links Kenya has with Uganda, but the indirect links, especially the social links amongst their peoples, especially business deals between leaders or big business persons, those are all indirect links, which would then influence the decision that we get a mediator to intervene in this situation. So although direct links may indicate mutual interests, shared preferences, and decreased uncertainty between the warring countries, these links either lose importance or become cut off as soon as parties enter a conflict. By contrast, indirect ties create a social network. By contrast, indirect ties create a social network that directly involves outside parties into a dispute process. And this usually increases the exchange of information between belligerents and potential mediators, as well as the chances that third parties have a vital interest in intervention. In other words, direct relationship between the fighting parties may not necessarily be the most influential ones in determining the likelihood of mediation onset. Okay. Now we have to develop what we would call a theory of international mediation and social networks. There's quite a relationship there. People never know that. You know, I would like to point out again, I know the dispute, the situation in Kenya in 2007, 2008 had belligerents or combatants, I don't call them combatants, but the disputing parties were all in country in Kenya. Honorable Mwai Kibaki on one end and Raila Amolo Odinga on the other. Okay, Emilio Mwai Kibaki and Raila Amolo Odinga on the other. Both Kenyan, disputing over the Kenyan election. But because of the violence that had taken place, the conflict had become international. It had been internationalized. Watu waling'oa reli, flights were disrupted, people were displaced, people had moved across the borders. You know the people who had run out of Kenya heading to Uganda, quite a number of refugees there. In that situation, the conflict had been internationalized. Then when time came for mediation, this question of social networks came into play. Who would mediate, people would ask. Who would be acceptable to both parties? And the first proposal was actually Kufuor, at that time, the president of the African Union, the Ghanaian president at that time. And the two parties could not agree on having Kufuor mediate because he was assumed to be having social networks with Emilio Mwai Kibaki. Then a proposal was made to have Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, a former trade unionist, and he was also rejected on the grounds that he had social ties with probably Raila Amolo Odinga. That's when it was agreed that they would have Kofi Annan to mediate that dispute. Now, a social network is a finite set of nodes, N-O-D-E-S, okay? A social network is a finite set of nodes, that is to say, actors, and by the links, relationships that tie two or more actors to each other. Okay? A finite set of nodes that tie that tie two or more actors to each other. For example, shared international organization memberships, you know, like we talk of the African bloc, a member of IGAD, a member of SADC, a member of AU, all these networks that they have, the trade relations, okay, where you have, for example, Kenya having a bulk of its exports within the region headed to Uganda usually, and the bulk of exports from Uganda usually headed to Sudan. You know, those trade relations constitute the social networks that countries have between themselves and between their peoples. Okay, and that is one of the descriptions of social networks that would have a strong influence over international mediation. So the IGO memberships, the trade relations, and other sorts of contacts can all be considered links between countries. Okay. For example, in this country alone, you know that Raila Amolo Odinga has quite a cordial relationship with the current president. I think he's also president-elect, John Pombe Magufuli of Tanzania. Okay, and probably the relationship between Raila and Museveni might not be so good because of the history they might be sharing or something like that. But generally, these links are necessary to determine whether there will be a mediation or not. However, it should be noted that not all links in a network are created equal. Some links are likely to generate or promote the onset of mediation, while others may not necessarily facilitate it. On one hand, you will discover that the belligerents may share direct links, as would be the dense and short connections between two states. And we know that most states, through direct links, are connected. In addition to direct ties, the warring parties may also share indirect links. This would be ties to one or more intermediary or intermediaries that connects the fighting dyad. Like who is supplying arms to who? Imagine if we have the same source of arms, and a number of arms dealers do this. They supply arms to belligerents. They also supply arms to governments. That is quite a connection based on who is supplying arms to who. And such a tie can actually influence an onset for mediation. So links in social networks, both direct and indirect, facilitate the transmitting of information without interest and intentions. And these links promote a common understanding. The links that are shorter and denser convey information with lower costs. They will convey them more precisely and faster. And this would ultimately lead to decreased uncertainty and more trust, as well as mutually accepted norms. Now, according to this mechanism, okay, where we have shorter and denser links, it is generally plausible to assume that stronger and more information flows. It's generally plausible to assume that stronger and more efficient information flows, FLOWS, between disputants would lead to a higher likelihood of mediation, since conflict resolution depends on the credible and truthful transmission of information. What is the effect of direct links on the onset of mediation? Now, the circumstances of mediation are different from those of the onset of conflict, mainly because mediation is usually employed during ongoing hostilities, where conflict has already broken out over one or more issues. And this in turn makes it less likely. That direct links will have much influence on the mediation onset. If the main function of direct links is to convey information and to decrease uncertainty. So the first possible effect is that most, if not all, aspects that led to a conflict usually become common knowledge after the conflict occurrence. Okay, just because of the direct links that the belligerents have, we know that most of the aspects that led to the conflict will become common knowledge after the conflict occurrence. Like states' behavior over the course of a dispute would usually reveal their preferences. And by reducing or by revealing the preferences, it decreases uncertainty significantly relative to the pre-conflict situation. Therefore, after the onset of a dispute, fighting parties know what the conflict is about, especially if they've had these direct links. Okay, we're trying to examine the influence of direct needs on the onset of mediation. On the onset of mediation. Okay, so secondly, conveying information through direct links is seen as helpful for enhancing cooperation between countries, since these ties develop a mutual understanding about the common good and good relations. These features are less likely to apply after the onset of a conflict. However, when disputing parties seek to maximize their own benefits over the opponent, and considerations such as norms or a history of good relations, they are less likely to weigh heavily on the belligerents. They are less likely to weigh heavily on the belligerents. For example, before World War I, Britain had a fairly good relations with Germany. The German Emperor Wilhelm II was a grandson of Queen Victoria. Both countries were able to reach an agreement on the share of the colonies in 1913 and were able to settle their differences on the Baghdad Railway in 1914. However, after the outbreak of war between Great Britain and Germany, neither party referred to their previous good relations, but concentrated on the war effort instead. Third, mediation is a costly way to solve conflicts peacefully. The warring parties have to agree on a third party, negotiate with the intervener, and ultimately lose some degree of control over the bargaining process to the mediator. Therefore, there is no a priori reason, there is no predetermined reason, there is no a priori reason why warring parties, there is no a priori reason why warring parties should agree to mediation as a conflict resolution instrument when strong direct ties can endure into conflict. Now, in this case, other less conflict management, in this case, other less costly conflict management techniques such as bilateral negotiations, may be feasible and the antagonists should be likely to obtain a resolution, sorry, in this case, other less costly conflict management techniques, such as bilateral negotiations, may be feasible, and the antagonists should be likely to obtain a resolution of the conflict without intervention of a third party. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Saudi Arabia and Yemen entered a border conflict in 1994, for example. And both countries shared reasonably strong direct ties with each other before. The belligerents did not seek mediation for settling their dispute, but engaged in bilateral negotiations instead. Finally, it could be assumed that direct links are retained during disputes. However, direct ties between parties tend to be torn apart when states engage in overt conflict. And once this is deactivated, any prior links are unlikely to promote mediation. For example, although the United Kingdom in 1982 had direct ties with Argentina, and this is close to 39 direct ties through the international government organizations, and had various other sorts of contact through diplomatic exchange. As soon as the Falklands War began, Britain cut diplomatic relations to Argentina within 24 hours. Thus, even if one of the conflict countries might have wanted to approach the other party to discuss possible mechanisms for mediation and the specific terms for the mediation, there would have been a few direct avenues of doing so. Okay, so this example of UK and Argentina in 1982, when the Falklands War breaks out, shows that even though there have been strong ties, the emergence of a conflict can sever those ties, and reconstituting them so that you may agree on mediation can become a tall order. So we could conclude that ties in social networks convey information and thereby decrease uncertainty between the belligerents. Will this guy come through? Are they planning to talk and things like that? Then direct links are certainly not an exception to this rule. However, these ties either lose their importance or become cut off once states enter into an overt conflict. So we can hypothesize, one, that direct links between belligerents will not influence the likelihood of mediation onset. The hypothesis is direct links between belligerents will not influence the likelihood of mediation onset. And as we dig up our material, anything that will nullify that position will be actually saying that direct links between belligerents would influence the likelihood of the onset of mediation. So while we have already said that direct links will not influence mediation onset, some kind of communication between the disputants is a necessary condition for coordinating the mediation. So the indirect links, the direct links we have said are not a guarantee we'll have mediation will kick off. But we always have indirect links, and some of these might contribute to the onset. Ties connecting the wrangling parties via one or more intermediaries, or more specifically, indirect links between belligerents, satisfy this requirement. But unlike direct ties, indirect links address both demand and supply side incentives by involving the entire set of actors and modes in a network. For example, the international community. So information about interests, intentions, and understandings are disseminated in this situation via the prospective mediators and not dependent on the disputing parties alone. This is the effect of indirect ties. So indirect ties are a substitute for direct links within the context of mediation, and indeed may actually replace direct links completely. First, we have to agree that indirect links. First, we have to agree that indirect links promote mediation onset for the simple reason that they expand the set of possible mediators in a network. Secondly, indirect links connect parties. Indirect links connect parties to other states outside the dyad and determine the destiny, that is, the concentration or cohesiveness of a social network as measured by the number and strength of links. Thirdly, indirect ties do not only facilitate transmitting information from the dyad to potential mediators. Countries with various ties to outside parties are extensively involved in relationships with the latter. Finally, indirect links are also beneficial from the perspective of outside actors who would be willing to intervene. Third parties are only accepted as mediators if they are likely to produce an agreement or help the parties out of a predicament. And for this, they usually need leverage. They'll need leverage. Okay. States must have the ability to threaten or to bribe other countries. And that is what using leverage means in order to ensure cooperation. I don't know if you've been following what has been going on with regard to the appointment of the new World Trade Organization head. Consensus had so far reached to this African Nigerian lady. And for some reason, the US just breached the consensus and says, no, 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 we want the Korean. Okay. And between now and probably another 10 to 12 days when the General Council seats of the World Trade Organization, things could have shifted. The consensus could have been largely undermined, especially if there's a state that has capacity to threaten or to bribe. Now, stronger indirect ties are likely to increase the incentives of actors in the international environment to assist in the conflict management process, as these ties make outside states more aware of potential negative externalities. So, it can therefore be concluded that indirect links replace direct ties when we consider whether disputes are likely to see mediation or not. More and stronger indirect ties between a dyad will increase the number of potential mediators. It will allow a more effective transmission and reception of information, and also would enhance the supply side pressures. These supply side pressures are the mediator side in terms of leverage. This ultimately promotes the likelihood of mediation onset, as is the case. Now, this question of leverage, of course, sure, even the mediator himself usually has their own leverage. And we had in this Kenyan situation, Kofi Annan is around. We have a team of Mikey Baki and the negotiator Martha Karua, and I don't know whoever was on that side. And then we have the side of Raila Amolo Odinga and Ruto and whoever on the other side as the members of this process of mediation that was going on. But once in a while, Kofi Annan would ride on the ties that the Kenya has with the US and pull up something on Kibaki, you do this, or we do that, or the US has given me support, and we can do X, Y, Z. Some have even alleged that Raila was cowed in his individual capacity and told, let your friend rule, just share this nusu mukate arrangement. When he finishes his rule, you will be supported by the international system. So that's an ability to threaten, that's an ability to influence. You see, we have capacity to do for you this, so please go ahead, talk, and make sure this conflict ends. Don't play hardball. So then the second hypothesis in our discussion today could be that more and stronger indirect links between belligerents would increase the likelihood of mediation onset. Okay. So those are the factors that we could say determine the onset and the onset of mediation. This question of direct and indirect links that states have between themselves and others. You know, our membership to the East African community, our membership to the AU might come into play better than our direct relationship between Uganda and Kenya, between Uganda and Tanzania. The membership to this intergovernmental organization increases the number of mediators that could be able to tackle that. So we've reflected on factors underlying the incidence of mediation, and we've reflected also on the factors that underlie effectiveness of the mediation process. We've done a closer look. We've done a closer look on the question of direct ties and indirect ties, and whether direct ties can hold a mediation post-conflict. And we've realized that actually the indirect ties might stand out more. Do we have any questions? Okay, so I think we will leave that at now, so that next week we do the final issue on international mediation before we move to negotiation. Okay, so a few minutes maybe if you want to ask me questions. I'll leave it at that for now. Any questions? Okay, so let us meet next week. At the same time on Thursday.